My name's Gavi Begtrup. I went to Western Kentucky University, got a bachelor's in physics and math, and then got my PhD and master's in physics from University of California, Berkeley. About halfway through grad school, I realized that as I went down the corridor of research, you get more and more and more narrow, and started to think about how I could have a larger impact, or at least impact larger problems. So I got interested in policy, and a former fellow actually came back to Berkeley and talked about his experiences, and it sounded interesting, though crazy. And so I then started trying to get more involved and try to figure out how I could position myself to come to Washington. The selection process is, you're kind of a free agent, so you get to go around to a lot of different offices and interview and meet a lot of people. You can work in the Senate, you can work in the House, you can work in personal offices, you can work in committee. So it's very open. There were issues I was particularly interested in working on. I wanted to work on clean energy and renewables. But I also really wanted to work for a young member, and particularly a member who I knew had to consider politics. I worked in the office of Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords of Arizona. Congresswoman Giffords certainly had to consider politics. We had a difficult election, and that does, for good reason, color decisions that are made. And coming from a scientific background, I figured the policy part of it I'd be comfortable with. The politics would be something I need to learn. There are still times where people have to explain to me why a decision was made. This place is complex. There are a lot of different layers to do this. You know, every member is part of many different associations, if you will. They're Democrat or Republican. They're from the Southwest or the Southeast. Or from a coal state or whatever, and there's all these different cross-cutting issues that make decisions happen. And it's understanding why not only your member but other members come out on different positions, why they come out that way, that makes it so that you can really function here. I handle the Congresswoman's Science and Technology Committee work, which they have jurisdiction over basically all basic research outside of the NIH. So they have jurisdiction over a lot of R&D, so I handled all that, and then I also handled her energy and environment portfolio. The biggest issue we ended up working on, though, that year was the NASA reauthorization. Every few years, agencies have to be reauthorized to tell them what they're supposed to do for the next few years. NASA was up, and it happened to be a very tumultuous time for NASA. The president came out with a new plan for the future of human spaceflight that did not mesh with Congress's view. Gavi was the chair of the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee, so she had jurisdiction over NASA, which put us right in the middle of a very big debate. And this is a really good example of where you can't always tell where someone is just because of their party. So NASA has centers all over the country, has research all over the country, has industry partners all over the country. So you had members come out from all different directions on it, and it was a very, very complex issue. A lot of things surprised me. I think a big piece was just how decisions are made, and that's largely why I wanted to come here, was to understand why members made the decisions they did. And I think part of my surprise was how, and this is not a criticism, how parochial members can be. They really have to be concerned about not just what their party or people of their party or their district care about. They have to be concerned about what their district as a whole cares about, which doesn't always put you in the same position as the district next to you or other members of your party or other members of your coalitions. So the interesting and surprising thing has just been how much we reach back to southern Arizona and to figure out where people are on things and what their interests are. One of the coolest things I got to do was when the national authorization was on the floor, so when it was actually being voted on for final passage so that it go to the president, I got to go down to the floor with the Congresswoman and staff her there. She knew what she was doing, so I was pretty much superfluous. But it was just fascinating to be down there. It looks very different than it does on C-SPAN. You cannot really appreciate Congress and understand how Congress works without coming here. And it's pretty magical to be down on the ground floor watching members speak on an issue. On C-SPAN, you get this really, really narrow view of, literal view of the floor. You see the person who's speaking and a few people behind them, or you see somebody with a gavel, and you never get to look around the room and see what else is going on. And what happens is, it's kind of like stadium seating, and then behind the seating there's these wells, and members do huddle. And you'll see, when a controversial vote like this is coming up, you'll see the big players on the issue running around and finding members and trying to convince them at the last moment, literally at the last moment, which way they should vote. And that's pretty fascinating. As a visitor, you can actually see that as well. You can come into the galleys, which are above, and if you just sit in the galley and look out, you won't see much. But if you kind of sneak out and look over the balcony, you'll see all these big, powerful people running around trying to convince each other, just like they do with voters. Mastery of the thermal and electrical properties of nanoscale systems was not particularly pertinent, but the real power the real asset that scientists and engineers bring to Congress, bring to any situation, is the ability to analyze complex problems. And at the end of the day, everything, the way the news generally reports things make them sound clean, cut, fairly simple. But every issue is complicated. It's complicated not only because of the politics, but also because of the policy implications throughout the federal government. And that is, to a big reason, that's why it's interesting to come here. That's why I wanted to come here, was because little, quote unquote, little votes really have a large implication, to some people more than others, and they have very different meanings across the country, rural areas versus urban areas, different regions of the country. And trying to understand and put together that these wicked problems, these complex systems, and then figure out not only how you should vote, but there's many stages before you vote on how you try and shape that policy, is very complicated. It's very hard. And scientists have the ability to take big complex problems and separate them, right? It's like in partial differential equations, you have separation of variables, right? And you figure out how you can separate things into, this is a problem I can solve, this is a problem I can solve, maybe this problem I can't solve, so we'll set that one aside. And then you start playing the parameter space and trying to figure out, well, if I tweak this, it might make these people happy, but it might have this downstream effect that's really, really bad. It might actually, every once in a while, we run into these things where we put them in for wonderful reasons. We thought, oh, this is going to do this great thing for some energy piece. And then you talk to one more person who says, well, actually, at the end of the day, you didn't intend this, but this is what it's going to do, and it's bad. Scientists have the ability to break down those problems. Every once in a while, you'll be surprised at how your scientific background does help directly on the Hill. When somebody tried to tell me that their heat pumps were 150% efficient, and I pushed back a little bit that thermodynamically impossible, and maybe they didn't mean efficient. Maybe there was some other term. And you also learn that efficient has 15 different meanings on the Hill. But working on NASA, on rockets, when people come and talk to you, there aren't too many people with a PhD. There certainly aren't too many people with a scientific and engineering background working on the Hill. So when people come from those disciplines, come from engineering firms, from energy world, from the space world, and start talking to you, the level of conversation you can have is very different. And that means, that's great for the policy issue, but it's great for the country. Fellowship offers a fabulous opportunity for people to get into this world. Because, as I said, there aren't too many people with science background, engineering background. There aren't too many people with PhDs who work on the Hill. And the unfortunate thing is the number one thing people look for when they're trying to hire in Congress is, have you worked on the Hill? So coming in at not straight out of college at kind of a more advanced level, it can be very difficult to find the right niche. The fellowship is this fantastic ability to put really smart people, competent people, on the Hill for a year, and then a number of us out of our cohort of 30 my year, I think maybe 5 or 6 stayed on the Hill, not necessarily in their own offices. In my case, when it came down to towards the end of the fellowship, I knew I was just getting to the point where I actually somewhat effective. You know, there is a learning curve in trying to, I was finally getting to the point where I think I knew enough about what was going on that I could finally do something, so I wanted to then stay and do it. And I was looking around at other opportunities, and the Congresswoman asked me to stick around. So obviously that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't here in the first place. In DC, working in Congress is kind of the gold standard. It's not the only way to learn how the federal government works, but it is a particular insight that you'll get that you won't get any other way. I really mean that. There are a lot of people working in the executive branch that work in DC, that work close to where Congress is, and don't really understand how Congress works. It's not a fault of theirs, it's just that really the only way you can figure it out is by hanging around. And so regardless of where you go from the fellowship, a number of the fellows in my year went either back at academia or national labs or industry. A number of them went on to other policy positions. One of them went to the executive branch of the federal government to work at the Department of Energy or state or anything. Having this experience really opens the doors in a way that nothing else does.